Have you ever wondered what all 27 amendments to the US Constitution actually mean without all the confusing legal language? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about each of them separately in a fast and simple way so you can understand not only your rights, but why they're important. With that in mind, let's dive in. The First Amendment gives you 5 powerful rights. The first right is the freedom of religion, which actually gives you 2 protections in one. This protection prevents the government from establishing an official religion or favoring one religion over another. It also protects your right to practice your religion freely, but that practice cannot be used as an excuse to violate the law. The second right is the freedom of speech, which protects your right to say what you want even if it's offensive or unpopular. While broad and powerful, freedom of speech has limits and exceptions. Threats do not fall under the protections of freedom of speech, nor does inciting imminent violence. Freedom of speech also doesn't protect you to defame others, whether it be in written or verbal form. While there are other exceptions to this protection, the general rule is that you can speak your mind freely. The third right is the freedom of the press, which ensures that the media can report on the truth even if the government doesn't like what's being said. The fourth right is the freedom to assemble, which basically allows you to gather with other people peacefully and make your voices heard. However, the moment that violence occurs, First Amendment protections end. While the government can require permits and set rules, it can't ban a protest just because it doesn't like what's being said. Finally, you have the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. That's just fancy words for that you have the right to complain to the government and demand that they change laws and fix problems. The Second Amendment states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. These 27 words have launched thousands of court cases, influenced millions of votes, and has sparked a debate that has lasted centuries in this country. Despite the phrase shall not be infringed being included, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that the Second Amendment is not unlimited. The court in District of Columbia versus Heller, which was decided in 2008, the court held, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. However, the Supreme Court clarified that for any restriction to be legal, the government must demonstrate that the regulation is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. This means that the government can pass some restrictions, but the scope of how far those regulations can go is unclear at this time. The Third Amendment prevents the government from housing U.S. troops in people's homes during times of peace without their permission. This protection dates back to colonial times when British soldiers would move in with people, eat their food, and use their homes as a barracks. The Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. This right covers you as well as your home, documents, and personal property. The Fourth Amendment doesn't protect against all searches and seizures. It only protects against those that are deemed unreasonable as a matter of law. This means that the government can't usually search you or your property without a valid reason. That reason usually needs to be backed up with a warrant signed by a judge, but there are exceptions that we will discuss. A warrant is a legal document that authorizes law enforcement to arrest somebody or search and seize property. The Fourth Amendment states that a warrant cannot be issued without probable cause, an oath or affirmation, and a particular description of the places to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Probable cause means that a reasonable person would believe that a crime was in the process of being committed, had been committed, or was going to be committed. If these requirements are met, a judge will sign the warrant and it will legalize the arrest or search. While there are many exceptions to the warrant requirement, we do not have time to discuss each of these in this brief overview, so I will include them on the screen. If you would like a deeper dive on this topic, please let me know in the comments. If the government does conduct an illegal search, any evidence found is inadmissible under what's called the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine, unless an exception exists. The Fifth Amendment gives you 5 powerful rights in just one sentence. The first right is the grand jury requirement. Before the government can prosecute you for a serious federal crime, they have to convince a group of regular people, a grand jury, that there is probable cause that you committed the crime. This protection applies to all capital and infamous crimes. Capital crimes are those crimes which the penalty can be death, while infamous crimes are another word for felonies, which the punishment is more than 1 year in prison. A grand jury isn't a trial, it's more like a screening process. The grand jury hears evidence and they make the decision whether a case moves forward with prosecution. If they determine that there's not enough evidence, the case basically dies right there. This protection helps prevent prosecutors from filing charges just to harass people or for political reasons. You should be aware that this protection only applies in federal cases. Each state is free to follow a different process if they choose, so you should be aware of how your state handles this issue. The second right is to be free from double jeopardy. This isn't a game show. It's a constitutional right that prevents the government from trying you over and over and over again for the same crime until they get the result that they want. This means that once you're acquitted or found not guilty, the government can't say that they want a do-over. But this is where it gets interesting because this protection only applies to the same jurisdiction. So if you're found not guilty in the state court, the federal government still can potentially charge you for the same act as long as it violates federal law. This is known as separate sovereigns. It's rare, but it does happen.
Is it true you were a crack cocaine dealer for 7 years?
I plead the fifth.
You've heard this phrase countless times in movies and in TV shows, but here's what Hollywood won't tell you. The Fifth Amendment isn't just for criminals trying to hide something. It's actually one of the most powerful rights that you have, yet most people don't realize how powerful it actually is. The Fifth Amendment means that you don't have to talk to law enforcement unless you want to, and it also means that the government can't force you to testify against yourself. Prosecutors and law enforcement also can't point out the fact that you didn't talk or take the stand as a way to make you look guilty. Don't make the government's job easier. Plead the Fifth and talk to a qualified lawyer about your case. Fourth right is due process. Due process means that the government can't take your life, liberty, or property without following proper legal procedures. This means that all aspects of the legal process must be fair and impartial. The final Fifth Amendment protection is known as the Takings Clause. This clause limits the government's ability to take your property unless two requirements are met. The first requirement is that the taking must be for public use. Think about roads, schools, and parks. The second requirement is just compensation. So if the state wants to build a highway through your backyard, they can't just bulldoze your house and say tough luck. This type of taking is known as eminent domain. The Sixth Amendment gives you 6 powerful protections that kick in the moment that you're accused of a crime. First, you have the right to a speedy and public trial. This means that the government can't drag its feet in bringing its case before a jury. It also means that the government can't try you in secret to avoid the public from seeing. And here's the best part. If the government violates your speedy trial rights, the case will likely be thrown out. Not postponed, not delayed, dismissed forever. Second, you're entitled to an impartial jury that lives where the alleged crime was committed. This protection means that regular people who live in the area where these alleged events took place are actually weighing the evidence. Third, you have the right to know exactly what the government is accusing you of. This means the government can't play hide and seek with the charges against you or the evidence that they're relying on. Fourth, you have the right to confront your accuser face to face. This means if someone accuses you of a crime, they have to look you in the eye and say it in court, under oath, and you have the right to question them. It's much harder to lie when there's pressure, and a lawyer ready to expose any inconsistency with their story, as well as any motive to lie. Fifth, you have the right to compel witnesses to testify on your behalf. This is accomplished through a subpoena, which is a document that legally forces them to show up and testify. A subpoena can also be used to obtain documents, phone records, videos, as well as almost any other evidence that can support your case. Without this protection, your legal defense would rely solely on the goodwill of others. Finally, you have the right to a lawyer even if you can't afford one. This legal representation usually comes in the form of a public defender or other court-appointed lawyer. Today, public defenders handle massive caseloads to ensure that that promise to you is kept. Are they perfect? No. Are they overworked? Absolutely. But they're trained legal professionals fighting for you when the stakes are at the highest and when no one else is in your corner. The Seventh Amendment gives you 2 rights. First is the right to a jury trial in federal civil cases. The second right is to have the jury to be the finder of fact in your case, meaning they get to weigh the evidence and determine the credibility of witnesses. Once this decision is made, a judge cannot re-examine or substitute their own beliefs and opinions for the jury's, except under limited circumstances. The Seventh Amendment ensures that regular people, not judges, get to be the ones who determine who's right and who's wrong over matters of money, property, or injury. The Eighth Amendment prevents the government from doing 3 things. First, it prohibits excessive bail for those accused of committing a crime. Bail is the payment for temporary release of an accused person while they await for trial. This means you can't be held on a $10 million bail for stealing a sandwich. Second, it prohibits excessive fines on those who have violated laws. This means the government can't fine you $1 million over a speeding ticket. Finally, the government can't use cruel and unusual punishments against people. What counts as cruel and unusual punishment isn't always clear, and this question is still being litigated in the courts today. While the Constitution and its amendments give many legal rights and protections, it is not a comprehensive list of all the rights a person has. The Ninth Amendment makes it clear that the rights listed shall not be construed to deny or disparage other rights listed by the people. In other words, just because a right isn't listed doesn't mean that you don't have it and that the government can just take it away. The 10th Amendment is short, but it has a huge impact. It states the powers not delegated to the United States are reserved to either the states or the people. In other words, if the Constitution doesn't say that the government can do it, it is reserved to the states. This concept is known as federalism, which balances the power of the federal government with states' rights. A classic example of this is what's known as police powers, which allow states to enact laws for the public health, safety, and welfare of its people. The 11th Amendment makes all U.S. states immune from lawsuits from out-of-state residents and foreign nationals. This is a form of what's called sovereign immunity. Imagine this, you run for president and you win, but the guy who hates your guts is now your vice president. Yes, that actually happened in the past, and that's why the 12th Amendment was created. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr both tied in the Electoral College to become president. So Congress had to break that tie, and it nearly broke the country. The 12th Amendment fixed this issue by mandating separate votes for president and vice president. If no presidential candidate wins, or if there's a tie, the House of Representatives chooses the president, and the Senate selects the vice president. This change prevents political enemies from running the country together and makes presidential elections winner take all. For almost 100 years, slavery was legal in the United States, but the 13th Amendment shattered that evil system. In plain and clear terms, it reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States. While the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, the fight for equality was just beginning. The 14th Amendment covers many topics, but it did three big things. The first is the Citizenship Clause, which gave citizenship to former slaves after the Civil War. It reads all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. There's an ongoing debate whether this section gives what's called birthright citizenship to any person born in the country, regardless of who they are. Those opposed to this interpretation point out that Section 1 has a requirement that these individuals must be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. They argue that non-citizens are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, thus they do not qualify. Regardless of who is right, this debate is far from over, and it will likely need to be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. The second is the Due Process Clause, which prevents the government from taking your life, liberty, or property without fair legal process. This means you must have notice, the ability to speak, and the decision maker must both be fair and neutral. The third and final one is the Equal Protection Clause, which ensures that everyone is given the same rights and protections under the law. This means that everyone is treated equally and the law can't play favorites. While slavery was abolished after the Civil War, African Americans and many other minorities were not given the right to vote. The 15th Amendment changed this, and it states that the right of any U.S. citizen to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But just because it was the law didn't mean it was being honored. For nearly 100 years, literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, and violence blocked many minorities from voting despite the 15th Amendment. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that enforcement fully kicked in, and all minorities were able to vote. Have you ever looked at your paycheck and thought, the government is taking how much of my money? Well, you have the 16th Amendment to thank for that. Before 1913, the federal government didn't have the power to tax your income directly. They had to rely on tariffs and sales tax. However, the 16th Amendment changed everything. It allowed the government to tax your income regardless of where and how you get your money. What if I told you for over a century you had no say in who your senators were? Before the 17th Amendment, senators were chosen behind closed doors, not by voters, but by state politicians. The 17th Amendment turned smoky backroom deals into ballot box decisions and gave your voice more weight in Washington. The 18th Amendment banned alcohol in the country for 13 years until it was repealed. This time period was known as Prohibition, where the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol was illegal. For over 140 years, half the country wasn't able to vote. Not because they were criminals, not because they weren't citizens, but because they were women. And the 19th Amendment changed that. It states that the right to vote by women cannot be denied by the federal government or any state. Before the 20th Amendment, presidents didn't take office until March, even though they had won the election in November of the year prior. This amendment moved Inauguration Day to January 20th to allow presidents more time to start their term and agenda. In 1920, America banned alcohol, and it backfired quickly. Crime exploded and people drank anyways. By 1933, the American government had realized that it had made a huge mistake. The 21st Amendment ended prohibition and once again allowed the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol. Until 1951, presidents didn't have any term limits and could run as long as they wanted. Because President Franklin Roosevelt won 4 elections and served from 1933 to 1945, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment limited all future presidents to 2 terms, or 8 years in office. The 23rd Amendment gives Washington, D.C. residents the right to vote in presidential elections. However, it does not give them the right to vote in congressional races. Prior to the 24th Amendment, poll taxes had to be paid before you could vote. As we previously talked about, these poll taxes were specifically designed to prevent minorities from voting. The 24th Amendment prohibits both the federal and state governments from imposing any taxes on voters during elections. The 25th Amendment answers 3 important questions. First is, what if the president dies or resigns? If that happens, the vice president becomes the president. The second question is, what if there's a vacancy for the vice president? If this happens, the president will pick a new vice president, but the majority of Congress has to vote to approve of the person. The third question is, what if the president is alive, but physically or mentally unable to serve? If this happens, the vice president and majority of the cabinet can temporarily remove the president from power. Once this occurs, the vice president will be the acting president. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. One of the reasons for this change was that 18-year-olds began to protest that they were being drafted to Vietnam to fight, yet they couldn't even vote. People had one message: if we're old enough to fight, we're old enough to vote. And just like that, millions of young Americans got the right to vote. Last but not least is the 27th Amendment. It forbids any changes to the salary of members of Congress from taking effect until the next session begins. This helps prevent instant pay raises and sneaky pay bumps by Congress. After watching this video, I hope you have a better understanding of your rights and protections under each of the amendments that we discussed. If you're interested in a more detailed analysis of any of these rights or protections, let me know in the comments. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a like, subscribe, and share it with someone that you believe could benefit from it. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the next video.